So, unfortunately, I will not be as high energy as Dr. Petrosini. Yeah. Okay. So, actually, this is going to be a very different turn from that. We're going to talk about poetry. And poetry is a kitchen table issue at my house. My oldest son is still living with us. He works. He's not freeloading. But what he does before he goes to work, gets up about 4 every morning, and after he gets home is writes poetry. He's got about 8 published so far. He's 24 years old. And but he's been challenged by some of his friends about this poetry writing obsession. And because they ask, what is this about? What's this for? What is the good of poetry in our current age? And I've had that question myself. I've actually given a paper on this years ago at a different conference, approaching it very differently. But what I wanted to do is talk about where we are in the different, in kind of like the where are the poets, what's the status of poetry in our current time, and then also look at this from a recent book, Charles Taylor's 2024 Cosmic Connections, Poetry in the Age of Disenchantment, and then look at him through Owen Barfield, and then bring those to Walter Ong's Psychodynamics of Orality in Orality and Literacy. So if that's a lot, it might need 10 extra minutes, but we're going to work our way through. I have cut half of the paper out, so we'll see how this goes. So a lot of my thinking about where poetry is right now is influenced by Dana Gioia. I got to hear him speak on this years ago at the conference where I was presenting the paper, so I got to both speak and get schooled. But Dana Gioia was the chairman of the National Humanities of the Arts. He's a poet, essayist, and a wonderful reader of poetry if you ever get to hear him. But one of the things that he has talked about, and also David Biespel has talked about this as well, is that most of the poetry that we think of as academic poetry, respectable poetry, is spoken by these poets to each other in small, isolated corners in their own journals. And so there's more poetry being written now than ever before, but the number of people who are reading it and the impact that it has is very limited. So and a lot of the impact, the way that the politics of poetry work is that you publish someone else's work and then they publish yours, and you write up a nice review of their book of poetry and they write up a nice review of yours. And that hurts the craft because no one's telling the truth and no one in the general public is reading it anyway. So the most public, I think the last time there was any public discussion about poetry was at Barack Obama's, or at Joe Biden's inauguration with Amanda Gordon reading her poem there, and that got a lot of attention because she did a very good job. But it has very little impact. So part of that happened because, as Gioia says, poetry moved out of the public sphere and into the university, became a subject to be taught instead of a voice competing for space in public discourse. But Walter Ong tells us this started much earlier when poetic form was edged out by prose. Ong references John Stuart Mill around the 1830s, who profiles the poet as non-vocal and withdrawn, quite the opposite of the gregarious oral bard. And Ong says the poet has retired from the oral world. He is no longer singing or even talking to anybody. Gioia summarizes along the same lines as verse, which had previously been a popular medium for narrative, satire, drama, even history and scientific speculation, retreated into lyric, prose usurped much of its cultural territory. So this is in contrast to the end of the 1800s, despite some of the timing of this. when Joya tells us that a lot of the best-selling books were poetry. And everybody recited poetry. Ong talks about the McGuffey readers, which were a process. They were for oral declamation, teaching people how to read out loud. They had a lot of poetry featured in them. Everyone memorized poems in school and recited them. That was a common part of the curriculum. So what happened? Why did it slide into irrelevance? Did the poetic medium lose out to other oral media of the day, the radio, the cinema, the television? Did the appetite for ever new, ever novel information through new electronic media drown out the slow and aged truths of poetry, about which William Carlos Williams said, "It is difficult to get the news from poems, yet men die miserably every day for lack of what is found there." But if orality is never fully eradicable, because every child starts in an oral world, we should expect that poetry as a quasi-oral performance could reassert itself in any age. And Joya tells us that this has happened in part, and he profiles some that kind of broke out, and he references specifically hip-hop and cowboy poetry and slam poetry, all of which recognize the importance of improvisation, the fundamental need for oral performance, and the place of the poem among a living, speaking community. But this still leaves me with the question about what to do with my son's question, my question. He's not a cowboy poet. He's certainly not a hip-hop artist. And so what sort of poetry, what sort of value does that have for those of us who are trained in slightly different communities? And this is where we want to get into what poetry is for, and bring in Taylor and Barfield. Taylor's book attempts to describe and defend the romantic innovation in poetry. He really likes the romantics. He profiles poetry before Romanticism as operating by mimesis, or imitation, of a known and relatively stable order of the cosmos. Poets could draw on common images, symbols, genres, narratives, and patterns generally. The depth of the work of art, as Auerbach also points out in his classic work Mimesis, was felt through how the skilled artist arranged and referenced the underlying metaphysical truths of the cosmos. But Taylor narrates how the unity of those underlying truths has been upended by the end of a unified Christendom and the general disenchantment of the world. So, Enlightenment thinkers saw the chance in the cultural rubble to fully replace enchantment with what they called reason. The Romantic poets, Taylor tells us, and specifically the German Romantics of the 1790s, could not react against the Enlightenment with an answering epistemology. What they did, Taylor says, was not go into subjective feeling itself, but to, while they're beating an epistemic retreat, in Taylor's words, they used poetry to point towards unapprehended mysteries and tried to induce experiences of connectedness, sometimes by inventing new mythologies whole cloth. So not going back to mythologies, not just going to feeling, but they recognized the need for them, and so inventing them, saying there's something out there. So they believed there were experiences, realities in the in-between, between the perceiving human subject and the other, whether the other is a person, a landscape, a spirit, or something else. Taylor calls these interspaces. To Romantics, these interspaces were fundamental realities beyond the Cartesian split between the subject and the object, and poetry was a way to give language to readers and enable them to recognize and attend to these interspaces, creating in themselves what Gerald Manley Hopkins called an inscape, an inward awareness of invisible connections that network one into a meaningful cosmos, even if the explicit rational doctrines of that cosmos escape articulation. So in part of Taylor's argument about poetry comes from his argument about language. He is partial to the Romantics pulling from Renaissance language theories, which are trying to reclaim themselves what they believed were ancient understandings of language. And their approach to language, words carry power by being the right word for the situation, being the thing, while representing the thing. In the Romantics' hands, words do not work this way all the time, but take on their magic in a precise spot of time, then becoming an interspace between the human and the other. But here I want to bring in Barfield and trouble Taylor's argument a bit. Owen Barfield was a major influence on and friend of C.S. Lewis. Two of his works concern us here: Poetic Diction and Saving the Appearances. The latter is his mature conceptual history of the change in human consciousness through the change in our relationship to language. He used the term participation. There's problems with that. I can talk about that later. Through language, everything is representation, he says, but before humans separated language into symbol and reality, people engaged the world linguistically as an integral part of the world. The spoken word didn't refer us to reality. The word and the real thing or event were two parts of the same phenomenon. This is what Barfield called originary participation. And you can hear its resonance in Ong's description of an oral society, where language has not yet been extracted from real, in-the-moment social situations. We get closest to that kind of feeling, maybe, whenever someone says, "I pronounce you man and wife," and something like that, where the word and the deed and the event and the social situation are all one and the same. What Taylor seems to say is that Romantic poetics pioneered a way for poetry to bypass the question of scientific truth, not contradict, bypass, to lead people through language into participation with a larger sense of self in the world and world around the self. Can poetry lead us into this participation? If so, what sort of participation are we partaking in? Barfield's point in Saving the Appearances is that we no longer have phenomenological access to originary participation, because we have separated our representations into language for objective reality and language for subjective meanings. So this is the idolatry that he is referring to. So let me skip some things here. Barfield says poetry is thus changed as language has lost its participatory dimension. In the prehistory of language, he says, all speakers spoke poetically. All words had unconsciously figurative meanings, without a distinction between literal and figurative, and all speech was rhythmic, not as a strategic move to maintain memory, but because nature is rhythmic. His description sounds very much like Ong's catalog of the characteristics of primary orality, inorality, and literacy. However, as what Barfield calls the rational principles started to come to the fore, people started to use language to make distinctions, separating the known from the unknown consciously. Words started to have more specific reference value, stripping them of their enchanted meanings, but making them more valuable for logical discussion, better tools, better power. This process of separation made the unknown more visible and opened the way for people to use metaphor deliberately, strategically, to explore through trial and error the unknown by comparison with the known. In this way, Barfield defines the poetic beyond the realm of poetry genres. To him, poetic describes a linguistic engagement with the world that expands consciousness. This general poetic happens in science no less than in art. For example, what is an atom like? Is it like the heavens above, or like a plum pudding, or a set of pulsating strings? All metaphors. Barfield's argument is that as poetry became a conscious human endeavor through strategic use of metaphor, language was naturally separated into poetic and prosaic, making it possible for societies to separate into poetic and non-poetic speakers. In today's buzzwords, we might say the way was open for people not to be innovative, creative thinkers, but instead stay in the box of what is already known and mapped by prosaic language, without any enchantment of the mysteries and the larger cosmos surrounding the box. So Barfield quotes William Blake that if it were not for the poetic or prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental would soon be the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dull round. So Barfield argues the Romantic movement indeed followed the human impulse to reinfuse language and representational meaning. And let's see here. where does this put us with orality and literacy? Barfield acknowledges the use of meter as a mnemonic device, but draws the line of causation for that to nature, not the strategic innovation of any unknown ancient people. He also does not seem to acknowledge the impact of writing or of print on the question of this poetic process directly. Indirectly, his separation of the poetic from verse and his comments on historical eras where the poetic and prosaic were in balance, he likes the idea of them being in balance, such as in the innovative period of Shakespeare, might suggest how his theory interacts with Ong's ideas. But what do we make of this disjointed conversation between Taylor, Barfield, and Ong, and in the background, Joya? All three of them describe an evolution of consciousness through history, and they all tie that evolution to changing uses of language. All of them see consciousness evolving from unself-conscious integration with their life world through speech to a separation from cosmos, others, and self through abstract language. All of them note how this loss of interconnection, of originary participation, is felt as a loss, but the benefits of the distancing effect of higher order language are many and undeniable. As Ong says, orality is not an ideal and never was. Whatever poetics they may recommend, it would not be an attempt to return to the primary oral poetics of a porous world in which every word is chanted and every chant thrums the larger web of all beings in heaven and earth. So I'm going to get to some of the connections to Ong here. I say Ong's discussion of rhetoric and poetic would have been improved by interaction with Barfield. What Ong provides us with are some material levers that shape how people interact with language and that shape how poetry might speak again to our time. Here are a few implications. Like Barfield, Ong is deeply aware of how quantitative and formal demands on verse are stifling to the production and enjoyment of poetry in living human audience situations. So Ong's master's thesis was on the sprung rhythm of Gerard Manley Hopkins' poetry. So it emphasizes that such rhythm brings the poetry closer to the common speech of England, making it more accessible, while also setting it up to be best heard in oral declamation, the same way it was written. He said Hopkins wrote his poetry orally and only wrote it down begrudgingly. Poetry should still be in heightened and beautiful language, but the criteria by which it is judged must be the ear and imagination of the common person. Answering Joya's criticism, poetry contests might be opened up to popular votes along with editors, but always after hearing the recorded poem read aloud. I suggest we're in an era of secondary orality or something like it. Tiffany, I'm not sure what we should call it. Because the secondarily visual medium of the internet that Ong commented on at the end of his life has morphed to a video and audio-based internet. Podcasts, videocasts, and audiobooks are becoming the new norm in taking in information. So here are some of the psychodynamics of orality from Orality and Literacy and some comments on them. Sounded word as power in action. In oral cultures, Ong tells us language is a mode of action, not simply a countersign of thought, one with magical potency. I see our culture as moving back toward the agonism of an oral culture, and one avenue for poetry might be a traditional one in oral cultures as a stand-in for violent action, but with the balance of literacy to keep it a form of action, not an incitement to violence. That would mean encouraging and funding poetry to address issues of the day and publicizing performances of those poems as part of the national conversation. Only the ones that hit the ear and that shift consciousness through apt metaphor would have an impact. Putting the funding of the arts more in the public eye, including putting such oral poetry in visible public media, think about it on the evening news, would help address the problem that Beestville notes, that poets who address public issues can be underfunded and ostracized. You know what you can recall. In schools and curricula, challenge students to write their own poetry as ways to study and remember, and have students memorize and recite poems as part of their learning, sometimes in place of AI-riddled papers. Memory work and performance was part of my history in elementary school, in high school, in college. It might be better to replace a dull sentence written 15 times on the chalkboard with an appropriate proverb memorized and recited every day for 2 weeks. Things put into poetic form and memorized rarely leave memory fully. The humdrum poetic work can normalize poetry, which then students might take as a tool and apply to other areas of life. Verbomotor lifestyle. Simply put, as Joyce suggests, support and promote more poetry readings that are not focused on one superstar poet, reading only his or her own work, poetry readings that incorporate other forms of art and other poems as well. Many cities and towns have music festivals and concerts, and live music is still solidly entrenched in our culture. Bring in poetic performers as well to demonstrate how electric poetry can be when performed well orally. And there are a couple of other ones here, suggestions, practical suggestions. I'm at the end of my time here, but yeah, if there are any questions on this, but the basic idea I'm trying to get at is how do we make poetry live again, since it seems to be really part of us as a humankind, and how we make it oral and practical if we're not hip-hop artists.